The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is Be the Light in the Darkness. It's a theme that encourages us to look at the darkness from different angles. The darkness of hate and emotional darkness during the Holocaust. And it also encourages us to look at acts of defiance and resistance and explore how people found their way in the dark by lighting the path with acts of kindness. It's also a theme that makes us question the darkness today. Holocaust Memorial Day is as much about the past as it is about the present, and it makes us confront the ignorance of genocide denial. And finally, the theme of Holocaust Memorial Day also asks us to reflect on our responsibility to be the light ourselves, and the responsibility that we all have to educate each other on Holocaust history and genocide history more broadly. It's a theme that I am particularly interested in as an historian of the media, as I am particularly interested in the role of the media in inciting violence and genocide. In 2010, the Washington Post adopted the new tagline, "Democracy dies in darkness." Holocaust history and media history shows us that our humanity dies in darkness too. The Holocaust Memorial Day's theme this year concluded with the idea that our lights are more powerful when we work together with others. And I am pleased today to welcome two guest speakers who have agreed to share their knowledge and research with us all in the hope of making the light shine a little brighter in the world that sometimes feels increasingly dark. I'm very pleased to welcome a friend of mine from Aberystwyth University, Dr. Arvin Aarwin. She's an historian of modern Germany, and her thesis explored the flight from Prussia, the social memory of East Prussia and the Federal Republic, which is coming out soon, I believe, as a book. She also teaches a specialist subject on the Holocaust, and it is my great pleasure to welcome her to begin the session. Over to you, Ard.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that excellent introduction. And yeah, I mean, this year in particular, I feel like this theme of dark and light is very poignant if we consider all the difficulties that we are facing at the moment in the modern world. And, you know, Holocaust Memorial Day is always an opportunity to reflect, especially as historians. And so it's a great pleasure to be able to contribute to this talk, to this event today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Hopefully you'll be able to see my PowerPoint in a moment. There we go, that should be right. So, as Chris said, my name's Dr. Arddun Hedydd Arwyn, and I'm a specialist in modern German history. And my particular interests lie, as Chris noted, with social memory and the way in which people use the past in the present to either underline political motivations and needs in the present, or to build identities. And so I'm going to be talking today about the ways in which Germany has memorialized and remembered the Holocaust since 1945. So I think in terms of the scholarship on memory, what is very interesting about the Holocaust is its role as an international memory. So basically, the scholar Astrid Earle has pointed out that the memory of the Holocaust is transnational in its basis. It is shared between a number of countries. As we can see here from this slide, there are countries all over the world which partake in the memorialization of the Holocaust and events surrounding it. And the reason we're here together today is because of an International Day of Remembering. And what I find is very interesting about this memory of the Holocaust is the way in which countries that were not necessarily directly involved as victims or perpetrators of the Holocaust, nevertheless take on this work of memorializing the Holocaust in various ways. And I think, of course, that demonstrates to us the centrality of it as a moment in the 20th century and as a kind of a real sort of pivoting point in that century. But today the talk is going to focus, of course, on the country that perpetrated the Holocaust, that is Germany, and how Germany has commemorated the Holocaust since 1945. So to give you a little bit of a structure and what to expect from my talk, the first bit I'm going to talk about the history of the memorialization of the Holocaust in Germany. And I'm going to be using the work of a number of historians, such as James Young, Bill Niven, Dan Diner. And if you are interested in finding out more, I've also included a reading list at the end. But also then I want to talk about a particular type of memorialization that came from Germany. And that is the so-called stumbling stones, or Starpass Steiner. And they are a particular type of memorial that you can find in Germany and elsewhere now. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to use certain terms throughout this talk. I'm going to talk about memory. And when I'm talking about memory, I am talking about the relationship that a group or society has with the past. So I'm not really talking about individual memories and the recollection of individual experiences, but rather how societies remember the past. And of course, in particular here, the Holocaust. And so when I talk about the term memory, I'm referring both to a kind of more instrumentalized type of memory, often led by leaders within a country who want to create a certain narrative about the past. And at the same time, I'm also referring to a more general engagement with the past that involves the contribution of the public in things such as discourses surrounding the Holocaust. So an important point about memory is that it changes over time. It's not static. This group remembering, this social memory, changes over time and reflects the political and social context of the time in which it is created or being used. And this is, of course, the case for the Holocaust. And in particular, James E. Young has pointed out that how the Holocaust is remembered reflects the needs of that society. So, for example, the memory of the Holocaust in Poland is also a part of a broader memory of victimhood during the Second World War. And then elements of the memory of the Holocaust in Israel, for example, focuses on the theme of resistance. And as you can imagine, these things are useful for the identities of those countries. So first things first, I'm going to give you a bit of a history of the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust, rather, in Germany. As I'm sure most of you know, Germany was divided into two ideologically opposed states from 1949 until 1990. There was communist East Germany, which had close relationships with the East and with the Soviet Union, and then the capitalist democratic West, which had a close relationship with the West. And how the Holocaust was remembered was very much reflected by the political, or in the political culture of those two states. And it was the political culture of those two states that formed the memory of the Holocaust in this period. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the German Democratic Republic, or communist East Germany. So communist East Germany, as I said, fell into the Soviet sphere of influence. And the communist ideology found there definitely shaped their understandings of the Holocaust as an event, but also as the legacy of the Holocaust for the state. Jewish victims of the Holocaust were remembered, but generally as one group of victims among a broader cohort of victims. And in particular, it was communist victims of the of Nazi Germany that were most visible in the kind of public memory of the Second World War and Nazism. So under Nazism, communists had been heavily persecuted. They had suffered greatly in concentration camps, and many of them had died as a result. They were not necessarily treated in the same way as Jewish victims. Of course, they were not like rounded up and deported in the same way. But the GDR as a communist state focused heavily on the memorialization of communist victims of Nazism, of which Jews were also a part in their understanding of the past. So the GDR as a state saw itself as being fundamentally anti-fascist and diametrically opposed to the Third Reich. So they saw there was a real break in 1945 with the establishment and the introduction of a communist system. The system was overhauled with the establishment of communism there. And this meant that the banks and industry was nationalized, and a program of land reform destroyed the power of the aristocracy. And so for the leaders in particular of the GDR, these reforms removed the causes of fascism. They believed that capitalism created fascism, and therefore by rooting out capitalism, they had dealt with the cause of Nazism. They also saw themselves as being victims. Indeed, the leadership who survived Nazism had been the people who had fled Nazism. They celebrated communist martyrdom. So, for example, Ernst Thälmann, who had been the leader of the Communist Party in Germany during the Weimar Republic, who was killed in a concentration camp, he became this big martyr, was memorialized all over the GDR. And also communist resistance was something that was remembered in East Germany. And Jewish victims were a part of this broader commemoration. And I'll show you one of the big sites of remembering both Jewish and communist victims was the Buchenwald Memorial Complex near the city of Weimar. And as you can see, it's this big monument to the kind of victimhoods, but also the resistance related to communist victims. So Jewish victims were not the central focus, nor was the mass murder of all kinds of people. And due to the constraints of life within the dictatorship, there was less space for free public discussion and debate regarding the past. The Federal Republic, or West Germany, was slightly different. As you know, it was a capitalist, Western-orientated democracy, and therefore had very different approaches to the past and to the recent past with the Third Reich. And these can be generally split into three overlapping phases. The first was the immediate post-war era, which went from circa 1945 to the early 1960s. You know, these numbers aren't exact because you can't be exact with these things, but it's circa that period. In the immediate post-war era, Germany was still destroyed. It had been destroyed through bombing and invasion. There had been many military deaths and civilian deaths, and up to 12 million Germans had been displaced from Eastern Europe. So in the Federal Republic, in that post-war period, there was more of a focus on the German victimhood as a result of the war, rather than the victimhood of Jewish or other victims of the Holocaust. The focus was mainly on German suffering, but also on the rebuilding of West Germany. During the 1950s, West Germany grew economically and experienced what some have called an economic miracle. And therefore, the ways in which the past was used was to build on that sense of rebuilding and renewal, as well as Germans' own victimhood. The Federal Republic, like the GDR, also put a line between itself and Nazism by building a myth of 1945 as a kind of 0 hour, as a break with the past. Of course, this was not true in reality, and historiography since has demonstrated in detail that there was many continuities between the Federal Republic and the Third Reich. And I can talk a little bit more about that in the questions if anyone's interested. But the point being here that within that way of remembering the past, there was little room for Nazi crimes and German culpability, and also Jewish and other victims of the Holocaust. However, this began to change in the 1960s. And again, I was saying the memory changes according to context. And what we see happening in the Federal Republic was a new generation coming of age. The so-called 68 generation had been born after the war. And so they had less direct experience and connection and feelings of culpability towards the Third Reich. And therefore, they began asking difficult questions about the past. And this was often reflected in public discussion and also historiography. And it's only really in the 1960s that we see historiography on the Third Reich start to look at the Holocaust in earnest. This is also reflected in the memorialization of the Holocaust in this period. And what we see happening in the 70s and 80s in particular is a shift to a Holocaust-centered memory, and this is what Dan Diner calls it, where there was much more focus on Jewish victims and the crimes of the Third Reich and of Germans in education and in commemoration more generally. So thirdly, and possibly for us today, the most significant development followed the reunification of Germany. And in particular, as I'm sure you know, my cat might walk across the screen, so a bit of a pet cameo for you, just to warn you. The third and most significant development for us today is the reunification of Germany. And in 1990, the German Democratic Republic was dismantled and became a part of the Federal Republic. Reunification saw the extension of the Western system into the East, so the political and economic system, into the new federal states as they were known in German. So this is important because as a result of this unified Germany, there was a search for a unified past that dealt not only with one dictatorship, but with two dictatorships. And what we see happening in that post-reunification period is a pluralistic memory culture. And what that means is that there were multiple memories and experiences that were remembered and commemorated in the post-reunification public space in Germany. And I think Berlin is a perfect example of this. So the cat is now attacking me and not letting me change my slide. There we go. So I think Berlin is a perfect example of this so-called pluralistic memory culture. A stone's throw from each other are a vast array of different monuments and memorials to various victims of the dictatorships of Germany in the 20th century. And we can see these in these images here. We have the memorial to homosexuals persecuted under Nazism. We have the memorial to the Sinti and Roma victims of National Socialism. We also have, and as you can see in that image, that's right by the Reichstag. The building in the back is the Reichstag building. Then just down the road, we have the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And then also close by, there are crosses commemorating the individuals killed attempting to cross the Berlin Wall. So attempting to flee the GDR. So as you can see, there is many different narratives about the past in post-reunification Germany. And there are a vast array of sites that have very different functions in remembering these experiences and in particular the Holocaust. They are there to educate the public, to serve as a means of remembering events, but also honouring the victims with respect, the respect that they were not afforded in life. And as pointed out by Christine Hargis, there's no simple answer on how to memorialise and adequately represent these very difficult and complex experiences. And it's even more difficult as we move further away from these events, and those who experienced them and witnessed these crimes begin to pass away. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these memorials, the stumbling stones, the Starpass Steiner. So there's a particular type of memorialization, which I am particularly fascinated by in this kind of pluralistic and very varied memory culture of post-1990 Germany. And these are the Starpass Steiner. And these are small paving stones, small cubes, which have been made with a brass plate. And on them they bear the name, the date of birth or the year of birth, and the date of death, if relevant, otherwise if they've survived the Third Reich. Some of them also include the place of death and how the individual died. And these are placed at the last chosen place of residence or work of a victim of Nazism. And these Starpass Steiner, there are many of them there for Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but also other victims more broadly as well, including the T4 euthanasia, the people who died as a result of the T4 euthanasia program, but also the Roma and Sinti. And so they cover a vast array of victims of Nazism. So these began in Germany as a means of remembering victims of Nazism. And now you can find them all over Europe. There's some in Denmark, there are some in Sweden, there are some in Eastern Europe, in France, and basically wherever the Nazis occupied, you can find these Starpass Steiner. So it started in Germany by a German artist called Günther Deming in 1992. And there are so many of these by now that there's 75,000 of them all over Germany, and the latest one was laid in December 2019. What's really interesting, I think, about this particular type of memorial is that it's a private enterprise. The state does not fund these stones. Instead, individuals can fund them. If you go to the website, you can go there and pay 120 euros to commission one of these stones being created and laid. And so it is not a public memorial, but rather a contribution of a community and of people within the private sphere. So these types of memorials belong to a very prominent strand in Holocaust memorialization, which is the counter monument. So counter monuments are a type of memorial that are purposely unimposing. And in particular, this type of memorial has been taken up by artists who wish to commemorate the Holocaust. And it's done so as a means to convey these very complex and difficult themes relating to this history. They are an interesting form of memorialization for a number of reasons. They are victim-centered. An individual name and description of the fate of that individual victim is seen on these stones. These memorials are not meant to represent Germany, but rather individual lives within the context of those individuals' everyday lives. They weave victims and memory into our everyday lives as well, and into the fabric of that place. And they're meant to be educational rather than representative. They want to teach us about those individuals, give them a name and an actual place in the world. And they also contribute to building communities. Schools are often invited to help research the backgrounds of the individual being commemorated in these memorials. So I've spent a lot of time in Germany. I've had the privilege of living both in Bremen and in Berlin. And these are something, whenever I see them, I take a photo of them, because I just find them such a powerful memorial. And so this is a collection of plaques to a group of victims of Nazism who lived on the street that I used to walk down every day when I was going to the train station in Feldstrasse in the city of Bremen. And I feel like there's a very visceral impact of these. Every time I would walk past, I would stop and I would look at them and look at the family. The top row is obviously a family that were deported and murdered. And then obviously a husband and wife pair. And I would stop and think every day about, their lives. I'd look at the house in which they had all lived. And it really brought this kind of very visceral engagement with the past and these terrible events to my everyday life. I would look at the house and imagine them living in it and imagine them walking down the street as I was. And I imagine how they might have lived and looked. Similarly, when I lived in Berlin, there was also a Starpass Steiner outside the flat that I lived in oh gosh, the cat is jumping on the table now, in the flats that I lived in. And this was located outside. Basically, as you can see, it says, here lived Fritz Thurm, who was, we looked into his background, and he was a social democrat. And he had been imprisoned in the concentration camp in Lichtenberg, which is very close to where I lived in Berlin, and was unfortunately murdered by the Nazis in 1937. And so the impact of that for me was in my flat in Berlin. I would think and consider, what was it? Did he live in our flat or did he live in one of the other flats in the building? What was his life like? What did he do? And I felt it gave a real connection to this individual who had been a victim of Nazism. And it made me think about the Holocaust and this persecution on a daily basis. Obviously, I'm a historian, and so, these things are going to mean more to me. I'm a historian of Nazi Germany, and I also have quite a vivid imagination. And so, this is the impact they have on how I interpret these memorials. And that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be an individual engagement with the past that allows individuals to engage with these things in a way that is meaningful for them. But as you can imagine, and I'm nearly finished because I know I'm going over time, sorry, Chris, that these have drawn a lot of criticism. It's the thing that I find so touching about them has also been criticized, their everydayness. They become a part of the background. People literally walk on them without notice them. I probably noticed them because I'm a historian and I'm obsessed with history. And so it was bound to resonate with me. But what about other people? They've also drawn criticism from leaders of the Jewish community in Munich, for example, who see them as disrespectful because they are on the floor and that people are walking on them and that they become dirty. And so in Munich, instead of installing these now, they are installing plaques with an image of the individual. The reception was not always good. Some people on the political right and belonging to an older generation were less open to engaging with the past in this way. They see it as an imposition, as an irritation. And of course, Germany is a multicultural country. How do we bring this past to this very broad society in a meaningful way? So basically, I hope today what I've done is demonstrated to you, the memory changes, that it develops, and that, we're all involved in creating memory and in engaging with the past in this way. And I wonder, what is the future of the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust, and how can we take this forward, and how can younger generations take this forward in a way that remembers the victims, that educates people, and also honors them? We talk about this happening never again, and yet genocide does still happen across the world. And as we've seen in recent times, If we think about that theme of darkness and light, there is a rise of a far right in the US and in Europe and even in Britain to an extent. And also charismatic leadership is appealing to people. So beyond memory, we also have a task upon us to ensure that we build communities and we build bridges between people with different viewpoints, but to make sure that we all have a similar intention for our communities and societies. So I'm sorry for going over, Chris.
No worries. Thank you very much, Ard, for a brilliant and fascinating paper about the memory of the Holocaust in Germany. I particularly found the debate about the everydayness of memorials to be very interesting, especially the debate about whether memorials can be almost too ubiquitous to recall. I'm pleased to welcome the second speaker, Kate Docking, who has recently submitted her PhD at Kent University, which explores doctors, nurses and prisoners and their interactions at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Kate also has a forthcoming article that explores gender, recruitment and medicine at Ravensbrück from 1939 to 1942. And today she's going to talk about the power dynamics between staff and prisoners at Ravensbrück. Over to you, Kate.
Great, so thanks very much, Chris, for that introduction. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see the slide okay. I should note as well that I do have subtitles, but it hasn't recognised some of the German words, so apologies if it looks a bit strange. So yes, as Chris said, I'm going to talk about the power dynamics between female medical staff and prisoner hospital workers in Ravensbrück concentration camp. And I should note as well that before I begin, some of the content of this talk is of a distressing nature. So I'm going to be talking about human experiments that were performed on human beings. So when we think of doctors in concentration camps, the first person that might come to mind is Joseph Mengele. So Mengele is well known for carrying out experiments on twins in Auschwitz concentration camp. But just focusing on Mengele alone, I don't think tells us the full story here. A number of other doctors and nurses also worked in concentration camps and also carried out medical atrocities. This talk is going to explore some of the doctors and nurses who worked at Ravensbrück concentration camp. So Ravensbrück was a camp for women in the Third Reich. So here are some photos of some of the women that I discuss in my research. These women were employed by SS authorities to work at Ravensbrück. So in this talk, I'm going to look at how they interacted with the prisoners who worked in the camp hospital as doctors and nurses. And I'm also going to discuss how these women treated the patients that were placed under their care. So when we think of concentration camps, the first image that might come to mind is this one of Auschwitz. But when the Nazi camps were first constructed in 1933, they didn't represent a unified system. The camps that were constructed when the Nazis first came to power were sporadic and improvised. Inmates were interned in cellars and in basements, and it was only later on that the camp system evolved to represent what it does in popular memory, so this image of Auschwitz. So Ravensbrück was constructed in May 1939, and it was located about 50 miles away from Berlin, as we can see on the slide here. So initially, Ravensbrück interned political prisoners, so social democrats and communists, and it also interned so-called asocial. So the category of asocials was used by the Nazis to encompass anyone who didn't conform to the notion of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. So asocials included women who had undertaken sex work, women who were classed as drunks, or women who were classed as criminals as well. So Ard mentioned in her talk about the lack of commemoration of some particular victim groups, and indeed asocials have not been commemorated very much at all. They weren't commemorated for a long time at the Ravensbrück memorial site, and even today there is a stigma about asocials, and I think this kind of stems from the stigma we still have today about sex work. And it's a very interesting area, but I don't have too much time to discuss it in this talk. So overall, over 100 nationalities were interned at Ravensbrück. So women were sent to the camp from all areas of occupied Germany. And so we have French, Polish, German and Spanish inmates were interned at Ravensbrück, and also several British and American prisoners as well. So prisoners were housed in these barrack-style blocks, and the number of inmates at Ravensbrück increased dramatically over time, which led to intense overcrowding and prisoners living in squalid, unbearable conditions. In total, 132,000 women were interned at the camp between 1939 and 1945, and an estimated 100,000 to 117,000 prisoners died there. From 1941, women deemed too ill to work were sent on so-called euthanasia transports away from the camp. So the euthanasia program that was introduced in September 1939 entailed the killing of those deemed life unworthy of life by the Nazis. So that included the disabled and the mentally ill, and women were taken out of Ravensbrück to the specially designated killing sites. A gas chamber was constructed at the camp in 1945. So while Ravensbrück was never a designated extermination camp, over time it became a place where prisoners were living in constant fear of being killed and also living in fear of intense brutality. So the focus of my talk is on the specific site of the Ravensbrück concentration camp hospital, which was known as the Revier by staff and prisoners. So I just want to provide some broader context about this space. So Major Stewart, a prosecutor during the Ravensbrück concentration camp trials, which were conducted by the British and tried former staff of the camp and took place between 1946 and 1948, remarked that a doctor in a concentration camp is almost a contradiction in terms. Indeed, it might appear contradictory that there was even a hospital in the camp in the first instance. Why were medical staff employed to work in a concentration camp? But the SS were concerned throughout Ravensbrück's existence about the outbreak of typhus. So if a typhus outbreak occurred, it would not only affect prisoners, but it could also detrimentally affect SS staff. So medical personnel were employed in order to prevent the spread of this disease. And in the camp's early years, as I'll go on to discuss, some limited medical treatment was initially provided. So 3 female doctors were employed to work at the camp, and approximately 16 nurses worked there over the course of its existence as well. So the female doctors who came to work at the camp were mostly young, they were middle class, and they'd recently finished medical school. So the women that I look at in my research were not dedicated Nazi ideologues, but they were rather drawn to work at the camp by favourable financial opportunities and also the chance to develop their careers. So the camp hospital, which was known, as I mentioned, known as the Revier, it initially consisted of only one hospital building, but it gradually expanded throughout the camp's existence. So the SS didn't simply build new hospital blocks, but they rather took over existing barrack blocks and used them to house sick prisoners. The statement of Sylvia Salvesen, a Norwegian political prisoner in the camp, reflects the mass expansion of the camp hospital. She remarked, "These blocks increased steadily in number. Finally, the whole camp was more or less a hospital, for there were sick and dying in all the blocks." Medical conditions in the camp were initially adequate. So these photographs that were taken in 1940 and 1941 present the hospital as not looking too dissimilar from what a conventional hospital might have looked like at this time. So we can see that there was an examination and treatment room, And there was also a corridor. That picture there sort of looks like a conventional hospital corridor. However, over time, medical care at the camp steadily worsened to become almost non-existent. So various medical atrocities occurred in the space of the camp hospital from 1943 onwards, and I'll be discussing some of these in more detail later on in the talk as well. So women were subjected to forced human experiments, they were subjected to lethal injections, and some women were also forcibly sterilised. So the remark of Erika Buchmann, who was a German political prisoner at Ravensbrück, encapsulates what the camp hospital symbolised to prisoners. So she remarked that everyone thinks of the word infirmary as a long, still corridor with clean, white beds, busy doctors and friendly nurses. For the prisoners of the women's concentration camp Ravensbrück, the Revier was like every corner of the camp, a place of fear and terror. But I think it's important to note that the Revier was not a place of fear and terror at its outset, but rather it gradually evolved to become a place of complete, utter lack of medical care. So I just want to briefly talk then about the kind of main point that I'm sort of going to make in the talk. So I'm going to say that female doctors and nurses wielded power over the prisoners who worked in the camp hospital as medical staff. Prisoner medical personnel were continually subordinate to these women and to other male doctors. So from 1941, prisoners worked in the camp hospital as doctors and nurses due to SS staff shortages, and they tried under very difficult circumstances to administer medical care. But in spite of the fact that female prisoners were subordinate to female medical personnel, there was nonetheless room for a diverse spectrum of often changing encounters within this hierarchy of power. For example, inmate doctors and nurses could experience professional working relationships and more personal encounters with female medical staff, and we have an exceptional case of a strong friendship that developed between a nurse and an inmate. So I'm going to use a variety of different sources in this talk, including documentation from the Ravensbrück concentration camp trials. So as I mentioned, the Ravensbrück trials took place between 1946 and 1948 and tried some of the former staff of the camp. So some of this material is inherently problematic, which kind of leads into a broader problem really that historians have when we work with material from the Holocaust. So at the end of the war, the Nazis strive to destroy as much material as they could, which means that we often have to rely on this post-war documentation. So court testimony is inherently problematic in the sense that defendants simply might have lied. So why would the female medical personnel on trial tell the truth about their experiences in the camp? Because it could have led to them being convicted or being sentenced to harsher terms. And then we also have the problem of memory. So Ard mentioned the idea of sort of community memory and public memory, but here we have the problem of individual memory. So after the war, survivors misremembering aspects of their time at the camp due to being traumatized, for example, and just memory being lost with time passing. However, I make the case that these sources can be used to write a history of the Ravensbrück camp hospital and of the female medical personnel who worked there when analysed critically and carefully. So why then have I chosen to focus on this very specific example? So I argue that turning attention to everyday interactions between female medical staff and female prisoner workers in the space of the camp hospital can shed broader light on the fluctuating textures of how power dynamics actually played out in the camps more generally, helping us to see power structures as dynamic and fluid. Exploring everyday relations between female medical workers and camp staff also enables us to conceptualize the hospital not simply just as a space where horrific medical atrocities took place, but also as a space of dynamic and varied social interaction which played out amongst these atrocities. And I think by exploring social dynamics in the camps, we can begin to actually understand them as they seem more real to us and not just these abstract entities. So by looking at the relations female medical personnel experienced with prisoners, we can also begin to see them as more human, capable of normal emotions and interactions. These women were not simply brutal sadists, and I think it's important that we remember that. So exploring the interactions that female doctors had with prisoners also enables us to gain a greater insight into the everyday lives of prisoners as well. So in this talk, I'm going to discuss the interactions between female medical staff and inmate personnel during 3 different time periods. So just to start off then by focusing on interactions between 1939 and the end of 1941. So during this time, during the camp's early years, the medical treatment that occurred at the camp was reasonably adequate. So this includes the treatment of women who had sexually transmitted diseases. More than a third of women who were classed as asocial and deported to Ravensbrück were recorded as having a sexually transmitted disease, so venereal diseases were prevalent amongst the asocial prisoners who arrived there, some of whom were arrested and sent to Ravensbrück for undertaking sex work. So even if a sexually transmitted disease was not confirmed, women suspected of infection were still sent to a concentration camp, so that, in accordance with Nazi ideology, the Volksgemeinschaft could be protected from such diseases. So Ulrike Janssen, who was one of the doctors at the camp, pictured on the left of the slide here, remarked that there was a special room for those who had sexually transmitted diseases, and that they were treated in this room. So initially it was deemed imperative to treat sexually transmitted diseases in the Third Reich more generally in order to stop their spread. So here as well, we have an example of a poster that demonstrates the Nazi campaign against sexually transmitted diseases. So it says, contagious venereal disease is an impediment to marriage. So one of the female doctors who worked at the camp, to go back to Gerda Weyand, who is one of the women that I look at in my work. So during the early years of the camp, she administered adequate medical care. One former prisoner wrote to Weyand in November 1949, thanking her for treating her at Ravensbrück when she was ill with various ailments, including pneumonia and a bacterial infection of the skin. So since this letter was written after the war, the prisoner would have had no motivation for speaking favourably about Weyand, and she might well have just incriminated her. So I think, to me, this goes to show that certainly some medical care was provided during Ravensbrück's early years. However, the medical care Weyand provided soon worsened. Some former prisoners who worked in the Revier put this down to Weyand's romantic involvement with Walter Sonntag. So Sonntag was the head doctor at Ravensbrück between 1939 and 1941. He developed a relationship with Gerda Weyand, and Weyand married him in June 1941. Doris Marser, a German political prisoner who worked as a doctor in the camp, remarked after the war that, under the influence of her later husband, she was certainly so irresponsible, noting that Weyand sent people away from the camp hospital without treatment. However, I think we must be cautious not to deduce from this statement that Weyand was cruel simply because she was under the influence of a man. Taking this stance removes all agency from Weyand and overlooks the fact that she chose deliberately to behave cruelly. So during the camp's early years, Weyand maintained good relationships with the political prisoners who worked as doctors in the camp hospital. So Doris Marser, for example, was able to recall plentiful details about Weyand's life, knowing that her brother worked as a camp doctor at Dachau and also spoke favourably about her initially. However, over time, the relationship between the two changed and became sour, as Weyand became increasingly cruel towards prisoners. Erika Buchmann, a German political prisoner who I mentioned earlier, also remarked that Weyand was friendly to the prisoners who worked in the camp hospital, and that she didn't treat them as inhuman. However, Weyand became colder towards prisoners, which tarnished her relationships with the prisoners who worked in the camp hospital. So, as Weyand increasingly administered poor medical care to patients, the prisoner workers in the camp hospital reproached her for this. So the next doctor I want to discuss as part of this talk is Herta Oberhoyza. So Oberhoyza also worked at the camp during its early years. She arrived in December 1940 and remained there until July 1943. So Oberhoyza was tried in the Nuremberg medical trial, which took place after the war between December 1946 and August 1947. So just to give some brief background about what happened to her, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but she was released in 1953 for good behaviour, and then amazingly was able to practice medicine again in West Germany in spite of being convicted of a war crime. However, she was spotted by a Ravensbrück survivor who reported her, and then an international campaign ensued for the revocation of her medical licence. So basically, the West German authorities did not want her license to be revoked, and advocated that she should remain in the medical profession, which kind of feeds in with what Ard was saying about the narrative of German victimhood that occurred after the war. So to go back to Oberhoyza's actions at Ravensbrück then, a stark example of her cruel behaviour is the experiments that she conducted associated with sexually transmitted diseases. In February 1941, Himmler, who was the head of the SS, visited Ravensbrück and, noting the high numbers of women with sexually transmitted diseases, decided that venereal disease experimentation with syphilis cures should be carried out at the camp. So the treatment of those with sexually transmitted diseases, which occurred early on at Ravensbrück, was replaced with experimentation with this desire to find a cure. So Oberhoyza had specialised in skin and sexually transmitted diseases, and she was awarded this qualification in May 1941. So she was highly interested in this area, and one former Czech prisoner noted that Oberhoyza gave women strong doses of salvarsan, a drug that was used to treat syphilis, and remarked that there were deaths from salvarsan overdoses. And Erika Buchmann also remarked upon syphilis experimentation, stating that the women who were sent to work in the camp brothels returned to the camp, often infected with syphilis or gonorrhea. When they had syphilis, for example, they were given injections and were subjected to various experiments to find cures, or they didn't receive any medical treatment and were simply left to die. So why was Oberhoyza cruel to these particular women? She saw them simply as asocials and not adequate of proper medical treatment, because in line with Nazi ideology, asocial women were simply considered as not worthy of any form of medical treatment, and they weren't considered worthy of life. So in November 1941, prisoners with sexually transmitted diseases were selected for a death transport. Approximately 200 women with these illnesses were selected. So we can thus discern the radicalisation of Nazi policies more broadly, and how this played out particularly in the space of the Ravensbrück camp hospital. So women with sexually transmitted diseases went from being initially treated to being experimented on, and then finally to being selected for a death transport. So the next period I'm going to discuss is between 1942 to the end of 1944. So Oberhoyza was involved in other human experiments which took place at Ravensbrück. So these experiments involved the injection of sulfonamide drugs in artificially created wounds in the legs of Polish and French political prisoners. So these experiments were conducted with the supposed rationale of seeing how effective sulfonamide drugs were in treating battlefield wounds. However, Professor Karl Gebhardt, who ordered the experiments to go ahead, already knew before they were carried out that they were completely senseless, because he knew that surgery was better for treating wounds than sulfonamide was. So these experiments had no scientific rationale because the results were already known, and they were conducted simply to cause suffering. So Oberhoyza was responsible for the post-operative care after the experiments, which she administered appallingly. She deliberately withheld morphine from the women who were experimented on and gave water laced with vinegar with no apparent reason other than to cause unnecessary suffering. However, at this time, we also have a case of resistance amongst one of the nurses who worked at the camp. So Erna Boomer was sent to the camp in 1943. While at the camp, she helped a Polish doctor by smuggling letters out of the camp. And prisoners remembered her favourably. So to me, this demonstrates that the female medical staff at the camp always had choices. They could choose to either treat patients brutally, or they could choose to help prisoners. And this comes on to the last part of my talk then, which focuses on an exceptional friendship that took place between a prisoner who worked in the camp hospital and a nurse. So Gerda Schroeder was posted to work at Ravensbrück in April 1944, and at the camp she developed this close friendship with a Norwegian political prisoner named Sylvia Salvesen, who I mentioned earlier on. So Sylvia Salvesen was of high society in Norway, and she wasn't a trained nurse, but she did offer medical assistance in the camp hospital. So Salvesen recalled in her memoir, Forgive But Do Not Forget, that she went on forbidden walks with Schroeder, speaking English with her, a language that was banned in the camp. And after the war, Schroeder went to stay with Salvesen in Norway, which indicates that the two did develop this friendship. And Schroeder recalled in a post-war interview that it is unbelievable but true. A friendship developed over the barbed wire, indicating that although there was a clear hierarchical difference between the two women, they nonetheless developed a close friendship. So this is illustrative of the fluid ways in which power dynamics could actually play out in practice. The relatively privileged position of Salvesen as a worker in the camp hospital meant that she could cultivate this friendship with one of the nurses. So Schroeder also strived to help prisoners in the camp hospital. So she gave them injections of grape juice and also gave them medicine as well. So while this was certainly highly exceptional and any form of friendship between camp inmates and staff was absolutely not the norm, I think what it does demonstrate is that these women did have choices, and the argument they were simply following orders just does not stand up to the evidence, because women were never punished if they refused to participate in atrocities. And I think it's something that we always need to remember, is that there's no cases of anyone being sent to a camp if they refuse to participate in atrocities during the Nazi era. So there's actually cases of female guards arriving at a camp and then actually not wanting to be there, and they were able simply to be posted elsewhere. So the question then is why? Why did women participate in these atrocities? And that's something that I have thought about over the course of my research, but I don't have too much time to delve into in this particular talk. So the friendship that occurred between Salvesen and this nurse also indicates that prisoners were not simply autonomous beings in the camps. So we often think of prisoners as being completely dehumanized by their experiences, unable to have any emotion, but actually prisoners did still retain emotion, and they were able to form friendships and connections that helped their survival, not only with each other, but also in exceptional cases with staff as well. So to conclude my talk then, prisoner workers at Ravensbrück remained continually subordinate to medical staff on a hierarchical level. However, power dynamics played out varyingly in the space of the camp hospital. Professional working encounters, personal relationships, and friendship occurred between female medical personnel and inmate hospital workers. However, female patients in the hospital, increasingly over time, were treated with utter contempt. While initially medical care in this particular space was adequate, it disintegrated vastly over time. Some of the female medical personnel who worked in the camp hospital were directly responsible for causing the immense suffering of prisoners. And I think it's continually important to explore the actions and behaviour of the Ravensbrück female medical personnel, and also those of other women doctors and nurses in the Third Reich, so that the suffering they inflicted on their patients is not forgotten. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. A really interesting paper, and one I think that covers an under-discussed aspect of the Holocaust history, whilst also building on the fascinating work of Christopher Browning and that historiography of choice. Both papers, I felt, did an excellent job of adhering to this year's theme. Certainly, I felt it helped us to strengthen the light of our knowledge.